Most people believe retirement requires hitting a specific number before they're allowed to stop working. 1 million, 2 million, 25 times annual spending. Whatever the number, the message stays constant. Until you reach it, retirement remains off limits. And here's the narrative that follows. The earlier you want to retire, the bigger that number becomes. Whatever you're currently targeting, it's probably not enough. Double it, maybe triple it. Only then can you consider leaving work. This narrative dominates financial media because it's simple, clean, requires no nuance, and critically, it generates endless anxiety that keeps people clicking, watching, and questioning whether they'll ever reach freedom. But here's what the actual research shows. Research that most financial content never mentions because it complicates the clean narrative. If you're willing to accept one simple assumption, you could potentially retire years earlier with dramatically less money. In some cases, 50% less than the traditional models suggest. One assumption. That's it. And it's not some exotic strategy. Not market timing, not leveraged investing, not cryptocurrency speculation. It's accepting that your spending might flex slightly based on market conditions. Exactly the way every retiree in history has actually behaved. Today, we're going to walk through the math step by step, using real research, actual numbers, and factual data. By the end, you'll understand why the headline portfolio targets you see everywhere are technically correct, but fundamentally incomplete. Before challenging the traditional model, we need to understand and respect it. The 4% rule emerged from research published in 1994 by financial advisor Bill Bengen. He asked a simple question. How much could a retiree withdraw from a balanced portfolio each year, adjusted for inflation, without running out of money over a 30-year retirement? After testing every historical 30-year period going back to 1929, including the Great Depression, stagflation of the 1970s, market crashes, and extended bear markets, Bengen found that a 4% initial withdrawal rate survived every single worst-case scenario. The rule works like this. Take 4% of your portfolio in year one of retirement, then adjust that dollar amount for inflation each subsequent year. If you start with $1 million, you withdraw $40,000 in year one. If inflation runs 3%, you withdraw $41,200 in year two. Continue until you die or reach 30 years, whichever comes first. This research revolutionized retirement planning. For the first time, retirees had a framework backed by historical data rather than guesswork. But here's what rarely gets explained clearly. The 4% rule sizes your required portfolio to the maximum withdrawal you'll ever need, not the average withdrawal over your retirement. It doesn't naturally account for Social Security, creating an income floor later. It ignores that spending typically declines as retirees age. It assumes zero flexibility, the same inflation-adjusted dollar amount every single year, regardless of market conditions. It solves for the absolute hardest version of the retirement problem and applies that solution forever, even when the problem gets dramatically easier. Understanding this distinction changes everything. Consider a couple planning to retire at 60 with $90,000 in annual spending. Social Security will provide $60,000 combined starting at 67. Until then, the portfolio covers everything. After 67, the portfolio only fills the $30,000 gap. Using the strict 4% rule, their required portfolio equals $90,000 divided by 0.04, which is $2.25 million. That's the number they've been told they need. That's the number creating anxiety. That's the number determining when they're allowed to retire. But here's what the 4% rule isn't capturing. The first 7 years represent a known finite bridge, not a permanent retirement funding need. After Social Security begins, the portfolio burden drops by 2/3. The problem fundamentally changes at age 67, but the 4% rule treats it as identical forever. Now let's introduce one assumption and watch the math transform. What if this couple accepted that their spending might flex modestly based on market conditions? Not dramatic cuts, not poverty level reductions, simply acknowledging that if markets drop 20% early in retirement, they might delay a major trip. pause discretionary spending temporarily, or skip their inflation adjustment for a year. This is how every retiree in history has actually behaved. Research from David Blanchett at PGIM Solutions and Michael Fink at the American College of Financial Services confirms this repeatedly. People adapt. When markets struggle, spending naturally tightens. When markets recover, spending rebounds. The traditional model pretends humans don't adapt. It assumes rigid, robotic behavior that has never existed in reality. Bill Bengen himself just updated his research. In his 2025 book, published by Wiley, Bengen revised the safe withdrawal rate upward to 4.7%, based on expanded asset class diversification. That's a 17.5% increase over his original 4% number. As Bengen stated in a recent CNBC interview, those still planning to take out only 4% of their portfolio in retirement are cheating themselves a little bit. The creator of the 4% rule is now telling people the original number is too conservative. But the research goes further. Morningstar's 2025 State of Retirement Income Report, their most comprehensive annual analysis, recommends a starting safe withdrawal rate of 3.9% for those wanting fixed, inflation-adjusted spending with a 90% success probability over 30 years. However, that same research found that flexible strategies can push starting withdrawal rates to 5.7%, nearly 50% higher than the traditional model. Read that again. The same research institution, using the same methodology, found you could potentially withdraw 5.7% instead of 3.9% simply by accepting spending flexibility. What does 5.7% versus 3.9% mean in portfolio terms? To fund $90,000 in annual spending using a 3.9% withdrawal rate requires $2.31 million. Using a 5.7% withdrawal rate requires $1.58 million. That's $730,000 less, simply from accepting that spending might flex based on market conditions. The Guyton-Klinger Guardrails approach, developed in 2006 and tested extensively since, shows even more dramatic results. This research establishes simple rules. If your portfolio performs well enough that your current withdrawal rate falls 20% below your starting rate, give yourself a 10% raise. If poor markets push your withdrawal rate 20% above your starting rate, reduce spending by 10% until you're back in the safe zone. Using this approach, Morningstar found that a balanced portfolio with 50% stocks supports a 5.3% starting withdrawal rate with 90% success probability. More aggressive portfolios, 80 to 90% stocks, supported withdrawal rates between 5.6 and 5.9%. All equity portfolios using Guardrails supported starting withdrawal rates of 6.3% in their analysis. PGIM Solutions 2025 research introduced what they call guided spending rates that explicitly incorporate spending flexibility. For a 30-year retirement with moderate flexibility, their guided spending rate is 5.0%, 25% higher than the traditional 4% rule. For retirees with enhanced flexibility, those willing to make larger adjustments if needed, the guided spending rate increases even further. Now let's apply this research to our couple's actual retirement problem. Remember, they have two distinct phases. Age 60 to 67 requires $90,000 annually from the portfolio with no Social Security. Age 67 and beyond requires only $30,000 annually because Social Security covers the rest. These are fundamentally different problems. They shouldn't be solved with the same tool. Phase 1 is the bridge, a known finite period requiring $90,000 annually for 7 years. That's $630,000 in total spending. But this money doesn't all need to be available on day 1. A time-segmented approach can reduce the day 1 requirement. Years 1 and 2 might be fully funded with cash or treasury bills, $180,000 held liquid. Years 3 through 7 might be allocated to bonds or TIPS ladders, which can earn modest real returns before the money is needed. If we assume bonds or TIPS earn 2% real returns over that period, we can discount years 3 through 7 back to present value. Instead of needing $450,000 today for those 5 years, we'd need approximately $408,000. Total bridge requirement, $588,000, rather than $630,000, without changing spending, time frame, or risk tolerance. Simple present value math applied to known finite obligations. Phase 2 is the core, the lifetime spending need after Social Security begins. Once Social Security provides $60,000 annually, the portfolio only covers a $30,000 gap. Now, and only now, does withdrawal rate research truly apply. Using the traditional 4% rule, covering $30,000 annually requires a $750,000 core portfolio. But remember what the updated research shows. Using Bengen's revised 4.7% rate, the core portfolio needed drops to approximately $638,000. Using the Guyton-Klinger Guardrails approach at 5.2%, the core portfolio drops to approximately $577,000. Using dynamic spending research at 5.5%, the core portfolio drops to approximately $545,000. Using maximum flexibility assumptions from the research, around 6%, the core portfolio might only need $500,000. But here's another critical insight. You don't need the full core portfolio ready on day 1 of retirement. You need it ready by year 7 when the bridge ends and the core begins providing lifetime income. If we assume the core portfolio earns a modest 5% real return during the 7 bridge years while it remains untouched, we can discount the core requirement back to age 60. A $500,000 to $600,000 core portfolio needed at age 67, discounted back 7 years at 5% real growth, requires approximately $355,000 to $426,000 at age 60. Now let's combine both phases. Bridge requirement at age 60, approximately $588,000. Discounted core requirement at age 60, approximately $355,000 to $426,000. Total portfolio needed at age 60, approximately $943,000 to slightly over $1 million. Compare that to the original $2.25 million the traditional 4% rule suggested. This couple could potentially fund the exact same lifestyle, $90,000 in real spending throughout retirement, on 42 to 45% of the portfolio they were told they needed. That's a gap of over $1.2 million. Not through risky strategies, not through market timing, not through assumptions that don't match reality. Simply by segmenting retirement into its actual phases, acknowledging that Social Security provides an income floor, and accepting that spending might flex modestly based on market conditions. Now let's flip this analysis. What if someone has already accumulated the traditional target? If this couple has $2.25 million, the portfolio the 4% rule says they need to retire at 60, when could they actually retire? Let's apply harsh assumptions. No portfolio growth during the bridge years, zero flexibility, maximum pessimism about returns. At $90,000 annual spending, how many years could they fund before age 67 while still arriving with sufficient core assets? If they retired at 55, they'd spend $1.08 million over 12 years to reach 67, leaving roughly $1.17 million. If they retired at 53, they'd spend $1.26 million over 14 years, leaving roughly $990,000. If they retired at 50, they'd spend $1.53 million over 17 years, leaving roughly $720,000. Remember, The flexible research suggests they only need $500,000 to $600,000 at age 67 to fund the $30,000 annual gap for life. Under these conservative assumptions, with zero portfolio growth, this couple could potentially retire at 53 and still arrive at 67 with adequate assets. Retiring at 55 leaves substantial surplus. Even retiring at 50 remains mathematically viable, though with thinner margins. But those assumptions are deliberately harsh. No portfolio growth over a multi-decade period defies historical precedent. Add a conservative 3% real growth during the bridge years. If they retired at 55 with $2.25 million, they'd have approximately $2 million at age 67. If they retired at 53, they'd have approximately $1.9 million at age 67. If they retired at 50, they'd have approximately $1.8 million at age 67. The required core portfolio is $500,000 to $600,000. With conservative assumptions, this couple has 3 to 4 times the required assets if they retire in their early 50s. A late 40s retirement becomes mathematically possible. This runs directly against the dominant narrative that suggests $2 million barely funds a comfortable retirement at 65, let alone enables early retirement in your 40s or 50s. The research shows why. David Blanchett's work on what he calls the retirement spending smile found that real retirement spending decreases approximately 1% annually through early retirement, accelerates to about 2% decline in the middle decades, then slows again in the final years. That pattern means a retiree starting with $100,000 in annual spending might only spend $74,000 in real terms by their mid-80s, a nearly 26% decline from initial retirement levels. Healthcare costs rise in later years, but research consistently shows those increases don't offset the declines in travel, entertainment, housing maintenance, transportation, and other discretionary categories. The traditional 4% rule assumes constant real spending forever. Reality shows consistent decline with a modest uptick at the end that still doesn't reach original spending levels for most retirees. This research has another critical implication. Blanchett and Fink's 2024 and 2025 research found that retirees spend guaranteed lifetime income, Social Security, pensions, annuities, far more freely than investment assets. Their analysis found that every dollar converted to guaranteed income results in roughly twice the actual spending compared to an equivalent dollar held in a portfolio. In other words, retirees are afraid to spend their portfolios. They're not afraid to spend their Social Security checks. This behavioral reality means many retirees die with far more money than necessary, having denied themselves experiences, travel, and enjoyment because they couldn't bring themselves to deplete portfolios they'd spent decades building. The traditional models miss this behavioral reality entirely. They assume retirees spend exactly what the math says they can spend. The research shows retirees dramatically underspend relative to their capacity. Now for some important caveats. This analysis assumes Social Security remains stable. The program faces funding challenges, though current projections suggest benefits would reduce by approximately 23%, even in a worst-case scenario where the trust fund depletes and no legislative action occurs. For most planning purposes, assuming some reduction, perhaps 20 to 25%, represents prudent conservatism. The analysis also assumes this couple's Social Security benefits of $60,000 combined, which is realistic but above average. According to Social Security Administration data, the average retired worker receives approximately $2,071 per month as of January 2026, about $24,850 annually. A couple with 2 earners at average benefits receives roughly $50,000 combined. Higher earners with strong work histories can reach $60,000 or more. Your specific numbers will differ based on your Social Security estimates, desired spending level, current age, and risk tolerance. But the principles remain identical. Segment retirement into distinct phases rather than treating it as one monolithic problem. Acknowledge that Social Security or pensions create an income floor that reduces later life portfolio burden. Accept that real spending typically declines throughout retirement. Recognize that some flexibility in spending dramatically increases sustainable withdrawal rates. The 4% rule was revolutionary research that served millions of retirees well, but it solves for the absolute worst-case scenario and applies that solution permanently, even when the problem becomes dramatically easier. Real retirement doesn't work that way. Income changes, spending changes, people adapt, markets cycle through expansions and contractions. When you separate retirement into actual phases, when you acknowledge guaranteed income sources, when you allow for modest flexibility and natural spending decline, the math becomes empowering rather than terrifying. You may not need nearly as much as you were told. You may already be far closer to freedom than you realize. The question isn't whether this math is valid. The research is clear and consistent across multiple institutions and decades of data. The question is whether you're willing to plan based on how retirement actually works, rather than how simplified models assume it works. Run your own numbers. Challenge the assumptions you've accepted. Don't assume one rigid rule applies forever to every phase of a multi-decade retirement. The stakes justify the analysis. And the potential reward, retiring years earlier or with dramatically less anxiety, makes understanding this math among the most valuable financial exercises you can undertake. Your retirement freedom may be closer than the headlines suggest. The math is waiting whenever you're ready to see it.